When I first started taking care of houseplants, I had no idea that their care could change so drastically as we got into the fall and the winter months. I learned a lot in that first season. I've since taken care of hundreds of plants over several winter seasons, got through it just fine. And this is everything that I've learned growing your plants successfully throughout the winter months. No casualties. I'm Tanner the Planter, and this is the truth about houseplants. But before you bring your houseplants inside, you definitely want to prepare them to come back indoors, because when they're outside, of course, they can get a whole bunch of dust, debris, bugs on them, ones that you don't want to come into the house. Not necessarily bad ones, but just bugs in general. So here's what I like to do. The very first thing I do is just wash it off. I like to make sure that I'm getting all the back sides of the leaves as well. You don't want to miss any part of the plant, obviously, because they can be hiding. Bugs are really good at hiding. If you have some sensitive leaves, you may need to support them with your hand so that they don't break off. But just like this will be perfectly fine. You don't have to do like a harsh jet stream. Most bugs aren't going to withstand even something as light as this. The next thing you're going to want to do, and this is totally just by choice. At this point, you could let the plant dry, take it inside. But an extra step is to actually use a little bit of pest control. So what I'm using here is cold pressed organic neem oil mixed with water and just a drop of dish soap. So once this all dries out, you can feel free to just go through with your pest control here and spray it on all parts of the leaves. Again, getting the back sides of the leaves as well, because those pests, they like to hide. Keep this on here, apply in full shade if you're using the neem oil or any kind of oil product. Once you've allowed your oil to soak in for 10 or 15 minutes, maybe you let it dry out completely, whatever is perfectly fine. Now it's time to bring it inside. One more tip on this one. Once you bring it inside, you really have a couple of options. One, you can just put it into general population. What I like to do, until I've ensured that there aren't any pests, I like to keep it in quarantine. If you can put it in a different room, that's fantastic. If you don't have that luxury, just make sure it's not touching other plants. And a bonus little tip, protect your surfaces. If your leaves are still wet or your pot's still wet, put a little towel under there. You don't want to ruin anything. That's how you're going to be successful of not bringing anything that you don't want from the outside to the inside. So the reason you may need to reconsider where you're putting your plants in the fall and the winter months as opposed to the spring and summer months is because of our length of days and our brightness that we usually have from one season to another. So during the spring and summer months, when our days are really long and they're typically very bright, you can actually sometimes get away with keeping your plants a little bit farther away from the window because they're sort of grazing. You can think of it like they're eating a charcuterie board. They're not gorging themselves all at once, they're just kind of picking along the day. So they have a light source, a food source for longer periods of time. So they can get away with lower light during the spring and summer months because they're sort of grazing on it all day long or for longer periods of time. However, when the winter months come, those days are much shorter and usually a little bit more gloomy, so there aren't available calories. For that reason, you sometimes have to move your plants a little bit closer to the window so they're receiving brighter light. This is like a feast for them. This is like them going to the Golden Corral and feasting on something in a very short amount of time. They're still getting the same amount of calories, light calories, from grazing on the charcuterie board as they were at the Golden Corral, but you may have to adjust so that your plants can stay nice and happy and healthy during the winter. Little bonus tip. If you can't move your plants closer to the window, maybe you have a bunch of plants and for whatever reason the plant can't get enough light, invest in a high quality grow light. You can supplement with a grow light and grow your plants nice and beautifully, even in the darkest of days, winters, darkest of rooms, whatever have you. I remember the first winter that I had houseplants, I realized that I was watering way too frequently. And what I realized was because of the shorter days and the often gloomier days, my plants just weren't drying out as often as they were. So I kept the same schedule for watering my plants. So I was watering them like every 7 or 10 days or something. But because the days were much shorter, the water wasn't getting processed quite as quickly. So I was actually over-watering my plants. I say this to say you may need to reconsider how often you're watering your plants as we get into the fall and the winter months and the shorter days. Now, the other part of that is if you live somewhere where it's really cold and you turn on your wood burning fireplace or your central heating, your plants may dry out actually quicker, and you might find yourself actually watering more frequently in the fall and the winter months as opposed to the spring and summer months like I do down here in North Texas. Speaking of dry air, during the fall and the winter months, because your wood-burning fireplaces are on, or maybe because your central heating is on, your air can get really, really dry. And most houseplants are actually tropical, so they appreciate a higher humidity. Now, it's true most houseplants are acclimated or will acclimate to a lower humidity environment, kind of like we have in our homes, at least compared to the tropics, right? So there's a few things you can do to bump up the humidity around your plants to help them get through those really dry periods. The easiest one by far is just to group your plants together, huddle them together. When you water your plants, the soil gets wet, right? And then as that water in the soil evaporates, it's gonna kind of create a little humidity dome around your plants so they have a little increased humidity just around where they're at. You can also add a humidifier. Spraying your plants regularly isn't really a thing. You can't keep up the humidity that way, it's not realistic. A humidifier, grouping them together are the best ways to do it. No, the pebble trays don't really work either, but these two little methods are effective and will definitely get you through the winter months without those dry and crispy leaves. Should you fertilize your houseplants in the winter months, yes or no? Here's what you need to know. First of all, the idea behind it is that when your plants are experiencing lower light, they might not be able to process that fertilizer in time, and it can build up in the soil and you can actually burn your plants by fertilizing in the fall and the winter months. Now, it's important to note that this really usually only happens when you're using a synthetically derived fertilizer. So here's what I always say. If you're using a synthetic-based fertilizer, just cease fertilizing in the fall. I like to do like October 1st, something arbitrary like that as a general rule. The thought process behind it is that your plants are not going to decline because you're not fertilizing for those few winter months. So there's no harm in just avoiding your leaves getting burned, right? What I will say technically is if your plant is still experiencing growth, if you're still getting new growth throughout the winter months, feel free to continue fertilizing. I like to just cut the fertilizer quite a bit, dilute it a little bit further than you normally would, and that's going to help it promote that new growth still, but also avoid the leaf burn that can happen by over-fertilizing when our days are much shorter and gloomier, when your plant is not getting bright enough light. Now, if you use an organic fertilizer, an organic-based fertilizer, feel free to fertilize with that year-round, even during the winter months. Organic fertilizers aren't going to burn your plants, so it's perfect. A lot of times you'll buy a new plant and you'll get it home in the winter months and you'll realize that you've got roots coming out of the bottom drainage holes, or maybe you're just taking care of the plant one day and you realize my plant is root bound, and you ask yourself, can I repot during the winter months? And the answer is yes, you absolutely can. I have always taught people though to just wait. This is kind of like the fertilizing. There's no harm in not repotting your houseplants. Your plants are not going to decline because of the size of pot that they're in. Having more roots in your pot is actually going to help the plant dry out faster and avoid root rot. And that's really the number one reason why I actually recommend going into the winter months root bound. This is contrary to a lot of popular belief. I'm not really sure what the reasoning behind repotting your plants going into the fall and the winter months is, because when you do that, you're actually going to be surrounding the root ball with more moisture retentive material. So this is going to help the plant stay wetter longer, which during our short days of the fall and the winter months, this is going to exacerbate or increase your risk of getting root rot. So what I like to do is just keep my plants nice and root bound like this. This is going to help them dry out faster, and that's going to help me get through the fall and the winter months without any root rot. I can always water more frequently if the plant dries out quickly. That's not a big deal, but it's really hard to take water out of soil. So I actually prefer to go into the fall and the winter months root bound. Not really any science behind it, it just seems kind of logical to me. Now, there are some plants that are going to kick up quite a bit of fuss if you repot them during the winter months, and it's going to be harder for them to recover from the shock of a repot just because we don't have as long of days. Of course, if you're growing under a grow light, perfectly fine, they'll recover just happy. But most plants aren't going to really give you too much trouble if you repot them during the fall and the winter months. However, I just like to say, unless it's an emergency, since we know our plants aren't going to decline from being root bound, I just leave them in their pot, and I'll get to that chore in the spring. Now, of course, houseplants are largely tropical plants, so they appreciate the nice warm air. That's why they can do really well in homes. They actually like it about the same temperatures as we do. Usually between 60 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit is really perfect for us, and it's also really great for tropical plants. So what happens in the winter months when we get nice cold windows? Are they safe staying nearby? Now, here's the thing. We have really well insulated windows right now. This is more of a modern house. Modern windows have really great insulation. So unless you live in a super cold environment, being up against the window like this is not going to cause harm. In my personal experience, I've kept plants on the windowsill just like this in -2 degrees Fahrenheit. And the plant that I had right here, which was a syngonium, showed no signs of stress whatsoever. So that's my only personal experience with it in those temperatures with that specific plant. But it's never going to hurt just to back up your plant just a little bit. If you can feel the cold right here, if you have a thermometer or a temperature and actually read it, if it's below 60 degrees Fahrenheit, of course you want to back it up. But if you're just doing it sort of a DIY, if you are uncomfortable being this close to the window, just back it up. You don't need to do a whole lot. You don't need to go across the room or anything. Just backing it up away from the glass where it's not going to be exposed to those really cold drafts, especially around the corners right here. That's going to be a great idea to get your plants through the winter months in a nice healthy condition. Here's what you need to know about dormancy for your house plants. Now, most houseplants don't really go dormant in the true sense of dormancy like a lot of your outside perennial plants will go dormant. You know, where they like completely die back and then grow back at a different season. Houseplants don't really do that. That's because most houseplants actually grow quite near the equator. And that's important because there are two main things that trigger dormancy for a lot of plants out in nature. One is a temperature swing. So when there's an increase in temperature, that can trigger a plant to come out of or go into a dormancy. Likewise, cold can also do the same thing. So cold can trigger plants to come out of dormancy or into dormancy. The other thing is light. So more or less light can also trigger plants to go into or out of dormancy or even to flower, for example. So the reason that a lot of houseplants actually grow near the equator is important is because there's not a lot of fluctuation with those two things in that region of the globe, right? The closer we get to the equator, there's usually about 12 hours of sunlight and 12 hours of daylight. So the photo period doesn't really change. And likewise, the temperature doesn't really change either. It's all pretty much the same. There aren't any big temperature swings. So in those areas, those plants don't really experience much of a dormancy. So most of your houseplants are not going to have a true dormancy period. Of course, there are some houseplants that will enter a true dormancy period, especially your flowering plants like orchids. But generally speaking, they're really not going to go dormant. However, you may see a decrease in growth with your houseplants during the fall and the winter months, and that's because you have a decrease in light. They're just slowing down their growth because they recognize they don't have as much daylight from day to day, so they're kind of just surviving the winter until the bright, beautiful days of our spring and summer months. Well, folks, that's everything that I learned when taking care of plants in the fall and the winter months. Hopefully some of those things will help you be a little bit less nervous or maybe make you through your first winter in growing houseplants. I hope you learned something. I hope you share it with some friends, and we'll see you on the next one. Oh yeah, and don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe, and slap that subscribe button. No, don't forget to like and follow. Oh wait, no, don't forget to like and what do they do? Like and comment? Oh yeah, so don't forget to like and comment and slap that subscribe button. All right.